Hey everyone, and welcome to the Perfect Bite podcast, your fusion of food and entrepreneurship. You'll hear stories from chefs, restaurateurs, CPG brands, and more from the food and bev industry. All of them are at different points in their journeys, talking about their experiences and how they've cooked up something new. Let's dig in. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Perfect Bite podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Perkins. Today's guest has paved the way for new world cuisine and modern cooking as we know it. In fact, you wouldn't have the word fusion in the lexicon of cooking without him. Please welcome James Beard Award-winning chef and restaurateur, my dear fellow Lake County, Illinois friend, Norman Van Aken. Hi, Norman.
Hey, Sarah. How are you?
Oh, always happy to see you.
Oh, thank you. Ditto. Goes that way too.
Thank you. So you are down in beautiful, sunny Florida. I hope it's sunny today for you. And even though you grew up in the Midwest, you've been in Florida for quite some time now.
Yep. I've been here all my adult life. I came at the age of 19 and have lived here predominantly with mild exceptions.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to dive into it and how you found yourself there and the rest of your journey. So let's take it back. When did you first fall in love with food? What were some of your favorite foods as a kid?
I fell in love with food quite young. No idea that I would follow it as a career. No one in my neck of the woods in the little Midwestern area that I'm from ever talked about being a chef. Absolutely no one. And so it wasn't like a journey that I saw, wasn't even out there somewhere. But I absolutely loved food. My mother was a at-home mother for the first few years and cooked. Not a chef, but she made some things that I adored, especially her French pancakes, which were really crepes, but they didn't call them crepes in the Midwest. They called them French pancakes. Maybe they sounded more exotic or at least easier to pronounce than crepes. And she filled them with her homemade jam. We had a neighbor who had an astonishing garden. And in my very, very early years, like around, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, depending upon the season, it would be very normal for my mother to be either canning tomatoes or making homemade strawberry jam, the smell of which even saying those words, I can smell them. I can see the vision of my mother cooking, wearing her long sort of June cleaver skirt, an ashtray not very far away because she was a smoker of World War II girl. And so, yeah, my love of food was early on.
Yeah. And it sounds like you also had really fresh food too.
Yeah. In the winter, things were a little different because it was, as you know, from being a Midwesterner, snow covered the land, the ice covered the land, but we were outside a lot. We lived very close to a lake. I mean, like within a 2-minute walk. And so the lake would freeze over and, we kids would shovel the snow off and set up hockey or just go skating in general. And so there's nothing like doing those exterior outdoor activities in the wintertime to work up a heck of an appetite. And while we didn't have the access to the garden or to the farm stands that were part of the summer opportunities in the Midwest, we did have a very tiny local grocery. And so it was a kind of a cozy, semi-rural existence.
Yeah, very quaint. And like you said, just focused on the outdoors and everything you can take out of it. So let's talk about when you really had that aha moment of wanting to go into the culinary arts. I know your story, but I'd really love for you to share it with others. It's pretty funny.
I was born in the 50s, growing up, grade school, some of high school, 60s. At the end of that period of time, I was making those decisions one does about whether you're going to go to college or not. Part of that decision was informed by the fact that the war in Vietnam was on. And my intuition told me that is not a war that we're supposed to be involved with. And so there was a deferment if you went to college. And so that helped me make the decision to go to school, although I loved learning, always loved the atmosphere of being around smart people and books. And so for a little bit, I went to college, but I had no idea what I was going to do with it. I had a little tiny inkling of maybe being a teacher, a school teacher, or something like that. I mean, I really didn't know, but I realized that I had to take care of myself. I had to get a job and do something. So I stopped going to school and I began just looking for jobs that were available to me in this little area of Lake County, Illinois. And so I had a string of odd jobs, including working on a golf course, cutting the golf course around the sand traps. I had one of those crazy kind of lawnmowers that could do a figure eight in a heartbeat. I did some hitchhiking. I went around the country. I went to Hawaii. I was selling flowers in Honolulu on the streets. I hadn't worked in a restaurant. We did go to this all-night restaurant in Honolulu that probably planted the seed of what it might mean to be a cook, because there was a cook working in this bakery diner setting. And between trying to figure out world philosophy, where the world was heading, who our favorite musicians were, who our favorite writers might have been, and speaking for hours and hours, I was also kind of eyeballing that cook as he was flipping pancakes and scrambling eggs and all of that. Then I was going around, young man traveling around, hitchhiking here, hitchhiking there. I got a job working in a carnival. And my best friend's sister's boyfriend reported to us that a carny was coming to town, and he heard that they were looking to hire some folks to help work the Ferris wheel and the tilt-a-whirl and things like that. And I was 20, and I said, that sounds like fun. Let's do that. So we went over, applied for the job. They didn't care what we looked like. The crew was ragtag, to put it mildly. So for about one summer, I traveled with a carnival. We would, sleep underneath the trucks. We stayed in different towns and went from place to place. And so the only food I could tell you about at that point in time was carny food. And it was pretty, let's put it this way. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't homemade. It wasn't gourmet. It was just cotton candy and hot dogs and things like that. Then I got electrocuted one night on the Ferris wheel.
Oh my gosh.
Almost toasted me. Yeah, we were breaking the carnival down. Had to go to the next town the next day. So we had to take the whole things apart, the apparatus of the carny rides. And so I was helping take down the Ferris wheel. And when you're sitting in the car of a Ferris wheel, there's the place where your feet go. And a pretty good sized truck had to get through a very narrow area. And we realized that this one little part of the seat that your feet would go on was just inches in the way. Well, I was a gymnast in high school. So I was like, well, I'll go move that thing. And so I climbed up the wheel, just hand over hand, climbed up the wheel. And then while I'm hanging off the steel girder that the wheel is, I put my cowboy boot, which I was wearing, down on that metal footrest and pushed it aside. And as soon as I did, the Ferris wheel was not electrically grounded, and my body became part of the charge of the Ferris wheel. And so when you're electrocuted, I didn't think I'd be talking about this, but when you're electrocuted, it's so overwhelmingly part of your confusion of your brain, because we're all wired electrically, that I didn't know what was happening until the third scream coming out of my chest that I realized I was in trouble. And something told me to kick. And being the gymnast kind of thing, I was able to swing my legs up, kick the wheel, and my hands fell free. And so there I am. Now I was 30 feet in the air, and now I'm kind of hurtling backwards toward the asphalt. And miraculously, this small Mexican man managed to body blow block me from hitting the asphalt, full sail. Also, a guy wire scraped along my back and helped me a little bit. And it's like 1:00 in the morning in some little town in Illinois. And I'm thinking, I need to make a career change. After I recovered maybe 2 hours later, when I finally stopped vibrating from all of that.
Wow. Norman, this is not the story I was expecting.
Yeah, I forgot. I didn't tell you that story. Well, Sarah, there's more stories.
Oh my goodness.
So I did get another job. That job I found in a newspaper ad. I saw this one area of the ads that said, help wanted, short order cook, no experience necessary. I circled it and thought, well, I don't have any experience. I guess I won't have to try and bullshit these folks. I tied my ponytail way back and went and applied for a job that afternoon. It was the local diner of the town that was the next town over from where I grew up, Libertyville, Illinois. And I filled out the application, and the gentleman who owned the place was cooking. He came out and so he picked up the paper and he said, okay, we'll give you a try. Come in tomorrow morning. You're going to make $3.25 an hour. And I was like, I'm your man. So I got in the car, drove back to the house, and realized I have to be there at like 6 a.m. So I drove to a hardware store and picked up an alarm clock. Tom and Jerry's Fireside in Libertyville, Illinois.
Wow. I love this because, one, you definitely had some details there I hadn't heard of before. And thank goodness, in some ways, you were electrocuted, teasing you there about that. I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah, that's the remarkable thing about life is every experience, you may feel like it's a horrible thing, but it will lead you to something else and something else again. And so, you know, we have to stop ourselves from catastrophizing. We have to stop doing that to ourselves.
Yeah. And I appreciate too that you shared multiple steps in your journey before you even had your first job in a kitchen. Because I think, especially, there's been a lot of pressure, especially as folks go to college. Okay, you choose a major, and somehow you're supposed to decide your life at 17 or 18 years old.
Right.
And you and I, even, I think one of the things that we enjoy in common is that we like to do lots of different things and experience those parts of our passions and our personalities. And in your case, it was, well, I have to make money. Let me find what odd jobs I can do until the passion really strikes. So you started off in the diner. Tell us about how the passion grew from there and you were able to find yourself into your next culinary positions and eventually down in Florida.
My life story would not be able to be told if it weren't for the marvelous coincidence that it was to discover life in Key West for me. It was at this period of time, I was like in gestation of sorts. And I was looking, I was wanting something for myself that I think my mother and my grandmother maybe saw a spark in me and they thought, he's going to find it. It may take him a little while. My mom was very patient with me, and so was my grandmother. I was at a party in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. It was March of 71. My best friend growing up was going to school there. And there was a party that included his oldest brother. The party was winding down. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, where's Steve? That was the middle brother. They said, oh, he went to Key West. He needed to get out of town. That's another story, but I'm not going to tell that story right now. You need to get out of town. And I said, where's Key West? And they said, you go to Miami, but then you keep on going. And I said, anybody want to go? And there were 2 brothers at the party. And they said, yeah, we'll go. I said, when do you want to go? They said, let's go tonight.
This is 2 o'clock in the morning, you said this?
Yeah, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. They said, yeah, let's go. And got some energy drinks, if you will. And we got in their Ford Econoline van with those 2 guys, a girl that was at the party and myself. And 36 hours later, we rolled into Key West. And I'm like, where am I? I felt like I came to another world. It was not just another hitchhiked destination. It was something about it I could tell already. The smell of it, the flowers, the smell of the exotic things that you smell in a tropical place like that. The moonlight on the ocean as you're crossing those final bridges and then pulling into this town. It's an old town. This town was founded around 1822. And we found Steve's place that he was renting with his girlfriend. And he was like, wow, what's going on? And he welcomed us and we crashed at his place for a couple nights before we found a campground up the Keys a little bit. But that was the first time I'd gotten to Key West and I fell in love, Sarah. I ended up staying there for a month before I was broke and had to humbly go back home and figure out what the next step was going to be. I was not even 21, so it wasn't like I was going to the bars or getting a job in the bars or the restaurants or anything like that, but I loved that place. And so went back home and got a little grub steak together until finally in 1973, the girl I met in the diner, Janet, who became my wife, she and I managed to begin living in 1973 in Key West. She was 17 going on 18. And I got a job as a barbecue guy in an all-night place called the Midget Bar and Grill. And that was my second cooking job. The first job was in the diner. My second job was in this all-night barbecue place. It had no roof, not totally surprising for Key West. It was, an outdoor sort of a place, corrugated tin, partial structure, wooden walls. And the place might have been called the Midget for the size of the kitchen. And I remember telling the boss, whose name, everybody called him Bud Man. Everybody has nicknames in Key West. Bud Man, thanks for hiring me, but I have no experience when it comes to barbecue. And he said, son, that's okay, because you're working the graveyard shift. The folks who come in here will be so up. When they're getting their food, they won't notice your skill set. So just relax. It's going to be okay. And so for that 6-month period or so, I was indoctrinated into the world of slinging ribs and hamburgers and something called Brunswick stew and key lime pie, which was delivered by a woman whose nickname was Sunshine. Her name was Sunshine Smith. And fascinating young lady. She ended up becoming Jimmy Buffett's partner in business and helped him found Margaritaville a couple years later.
Wow. No.
Yeah, she came in with 2 pies, as she would normally have done almost every day. And I said, hey, Sunshine, can you bring 3? Because it was so busy last night that we're totally out. And she said, well, that would be impossible. And I said, okay, why? And she goes, because my bicycle basket only fits 2. So there we were, a small-time business operator, but she branched out when she met Jimmy.
Wasn't Jimmy playing at the Midget before he became Jimmy Buffett, really?
Yes. Small town, but a town with so many, many stories. It was so rich in stories. And I think, this is another thread that runs through our lives, is the fascination for stories and storytelling and marking our lives in ways that matter deeply to us because of the richness of those stories and fate, coincidences of life. Yeah. One of the things about the Midget was they had live music. Live music was a big part of Key West from the very beginning of me being there in the early 70s. One evening, there was a barefoot musician who played 6-string guitar by himself underneath the banyan tree. And people were like, wow, this guy is good. And he sang a song that apparently was written at the Midget called Why Don't We Get Drunk and Screw? And everybody thought it was pretty hilarious. And I think it wasn't that night, but it was soon after that I realized the person who came out with this album called A White Sport Coat and a Pink Crustacean was Jimmy Buffett.
Wow. I love the coincidences, and you have the best stories. You really do. This could be a whole series together, not just one episode. So you started off kind of more humble beginnings in terms of the types of food you were cooking, the types of places you were cooking. And did you start to enter the fine dining world and really start to find your niche in cuisine because it's really special?
I often said to Janet when I'd come home crushed, tired, smelling sweaty and like fish and caught sometimes, I am not going to be doing this. I promise I'm going to find the real thing for me, whatever it is. And it's going to be something in the arts. I know it is. I love Key West and I see this bohemian lifestyle. And I thought I'd be some kind of a writer, a playwright sort of thing or a songwriter or something like that. But this is also important for the young people who are struggling with their first jobs in cuisine is that I cooked for 6 or 7 years before I ever worked any place where the veil was lifted. Cooking can be this hardcore blue collar working class sort of bone crushing job, or it could be something that did intersect with artistic sensitivities and sensibilities. And for me, the first glimpse of that was in a restaurant within a hotel at the end of Duval Street, which was a beautiful place right by where the sun would go down and people would celebrate, called the Pier House Hotel. The restaurant was simply called the Pier House. I had been the chef of a restaurant a little bit further down Duval Street, but I got into a little drama with the owner because I refused to cook with Cheese Whiz, which he thought was a really good thing to do with a white wine sauce for the fish. And even though I was not schooled at all, never had been to school for cooking, I went, no, that's got to be wrong. But anyway, they hired me at the Pier House and I became the breakfast cook along with a woman born in the Bahama Village section of Key West. I was basically her grunt labor. She was fast. She was really good, but she needed somebody to help her a little bit. I was her guy. But what happened there was I began to see young people, younger than me, some of them, who had graduated from the Culinary Institute of America. And I was like struck by that. What's the deal? How do they know what they know? And they went to school for this. even applying for the job, it was around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And just at the moment that I was there with my resume in my hands, or application probably, the chef storms out of her office and she says, okay, whatever the pastry chef's name. Okay, Margaret, let's taste your cake. Come on, let's go. She was in a hurry, in a bad mood. And so the pastry chef's a little scared, but she puts her cake up on a cutting board, and Annie takes out this huge French knife and cuts it into a fast wedge, plops it onto a plate, takes a bite out of it, spits the bite out, brashes the cake into this garbage can right by her and said, that is dry. We're not serving that at our restaurant. Make it over, make something else. And I was like on my heels, like, holy cow, these folks care. They are into it. And so a light bulb began to go off there at the Pier House. And then I worked my way to the grill guy, and then I became the sous chef. The guy I liked working with, there's two guys I loved working with. One of them had been to CIA. The other guy had not. He was a stock market, sort of a dropout Key West character that I loved being with too. But the guy that did go to CIA, he had a job right across the way in a small restaurant called the Port of Call. Between the Pier House and the Port of Call, that's when Norman Van Aken moved from who and what am I to understanding that my life was going to change toward learning how to become an educated chef. That was the place. And cooking that food, which was Key West standards, is quite good. The people who worked, especially, had gone to school. The owner of the hotel, who was a very forward-thinking man, hired people that had worked on the cruise lines and worked in the fine restaurants of Europe. And so I was around the language and the technical understanding and appreciation for food for the first time, beyond the Holiday Inn in Colorado or the diner in Illinois or the barbecue place down the street. And then one day, the sous chef of the restaurant at the time was talking to the chef about what the special would be. And he was leaning up against a big Hobart mixer, just almost like lazy looking guy. And he goes, I'm thinking we should do a veal with a velouté sauce. And I was like, what word just came out of his mouth? And his nickname was Hooker. I said, Hooker, what is it you just said? He goes, velouté. And I said, yeah. And I go, how do you know that? He goes, because I went to school. And I was a little bit like, hey, why don't you just put it where the sun don't shine, buddy? But I didn't want to let him see that he'd upset me. So I said, tell me a little bit more. So he told me. I said, how much did it cost? And he told me how much it cost. And I said, well, that is never going to happen in my lifetime. So then he says, well, why don't you read? And this really stung me, Sarah. This really bothered me because I had always been a reader. And I said, hey, fuck you. I've read Dostoevsky. I read Mailer. I read a lot. I read a lot. He goes, but what about cookbooks? And he had me. I hadn't read any cookbooks. And I said, well, like who? Still not wanting him to have satisfaction of schooling me. He said, what about James Beard? I don't even know how I had the money, because I didn't have a checkbook, but somehow I had the money to go to the bookstore down the street. And I bought James Beard's Theory and Practice of Good Cooking. It was 1979. And I still have that book. It's up over my desk. That was my first book. And it was a great book to buy because the way Beard did that book was not the way most books are organized, which is by appetizer, soup, salads, entrees. His was organized by the technique that was used to prepare the dishes. That was a godsend. To have that be my first book was great. I dropped that book up at home and cooked out of it. I would bring it to work in my bicycle basket and refer to it. And that turned me into the person who became a manic cookbook buyer, because I never did go to school. Not ever did I ever go to cooking school. But I relied upon my love of reading and my ability to understand the books, and then the experience of cooking every day, because you're learning every day. The food is always showing you. The plates are showing you, the flavors are showing you if you can pay attention. So I am always proselytizing my young chefs. You got to work in the kitchens, but you got to extend your knowledge past where you may be cooking in, or you're going to shortcome yourself.
I think That is such a special moment and a special teaching for everyone right there. A couple of things. One, you picked up James Beard's book as one of your first cookbooks, and you end up winning an award from his foundation one day. Talk again about kismet and just the stars aligning for you.
Yeah.
And
When I bought the book, there was no James Beard Awards yet.
right, he was still television personality and cookbook writer and
School teacher.
yes, yes. And I also love this part of your story because sometimes we can't have the opportunity when we're in love with something to go to school for it first and discover the passion there. I compare this a lot to the saying, the joke that sometimes if you don't go and get your MBA from business school to be an entrepreneur, you just learned the MBA on the job.
Right.
And yes, at school, maybe there's terms or certain elements that you get a leg up on that you learn ahead of time. But the biggest teaching I think here is it doesn't matter how much you can memorize. It doesn't matter how much you can read. You have to know how to apply something to be able to learn it and to be able to master it. And I think that's really special.
Yes, absolutely. And being somewhere that matters to you is really important into whatever you're going to do with your passion, with your life. For me, it was Key West, and it gave me such a strong cultural field to work in. And I didn't understand in the beginning of doing it because those two restaurants that I began cooking and learning from, primarily they were trying to cook French food for American people, maybe with some Italian touches and things like that. But in both cases, they did have dishes that were part of the repertoire of the islands, like black bean soup and conch chowder, key lime pie. So those things began to inform my mind as this path moves forward, which eventually I got to a place where I moved to the mainland, to Miami, and opened up the restaurant Norman's, and that led to much bigger stages.
And Norman's is about to be 30 years old. Is that correct?
Yes, on March the 20th. It was March 18th of 1995 when we threw the big party in Miami. I'd say 500 people came to that party. And the restaurant didn't seat 500, but it wasn't a sit-down thing. It was a big stand-up hors d'oeuvres and drinks and all that. Just a huge turnout. We all went home. Of course, we'd been building the restaurant for months before that, like tooling it in our design. There was a failed restaurant there 3 times. So I got it at the only price that I could afford. It was an inexpensive restaurant in what they call a C+ location. But everybody felt, because I'd had a restaurant that I did do in Miami Beach, I had enough investors who felt like people will come to him. They will come to his food. I think that it's better to have a place that's not so expensive to operate from a standpoint of lease. And then on March the 20th of 1995, we opened up, and in just a few weeks, we will turn 30 as an ongoing entity as a Norman's Restaurants in America.
Just incredible. And what are some of those lessons and challenges? Just a few, because it's 3 decades worth, that you can share with us, when you were first starting off to when it was growing and you were getting a lot more recognition.
I can't say, it was predestined that I would have my own restaurant, but I can say there's no doubt that come hell or high water, I was going to have my own restaurant. My father was a car dealer and much different life. He was good at business. He was hardworking, but he never wanted to work for other people. He wanted his own shop, his own place, his own car lots. And I think that rubbed off on me. I wanted not to make someone else's menu, not to be doing someone else's food. I wanted to write my own script. I wanted to be able to take responsibility for what that meant and know that it was on me to make it better the next day, the next day, the next day. And so if you want to talk about wanting to become successful, then I think you have to have sort of an absolute mindset toward getting there. We all have read the stories of musicians or comedians or actors or actresses that just starved, the Beatles, for God's sake, traveling in the car, all 4 of them together, sleeping in the car for months at a time. They're the humble beginnings, but that drive to fulfill your own dreams and being willing to sacrifice to do that. And that was really key to the beginning of the restaurant. We didn't have a lease. I didn't have a deal. I didn't have the investors, but the landlord let me park my car and go in that empty restaurant for 6 months. I had no lights, but I would sit there with my books and my phone, and I would try and figure out who was going to invest in me, who I could hire, what the menu price point was going to be. I'd call on years of experience, and we've even had a chance to talk about some of the amazing people that worked with me a couple of years preceding to this, because that was 1995. As you know from knowing me now, in 1982, a young man came to work with me. He had been a busboy in the restaurant that I was working in 1982. So let's not forget, this is 13 years, 14 years later than me opening, when he asked me for a job in the kitchen. Name, Charlie Trotter. Those fundamental years for my growth was key. I was working for a man named Gordon Sinclair, who helped me move visually, in the vision sense, past being a cook, a chef, making dishes, to seeing the entire aspect of what it meant to be a restaurateur in America at this really important part of time when America went from kind of holding its hat to European cuisine to finding its own voice through something being called New American cuisine for the first time. And geographically, there became this identity that was being worked out, the Southwestern food movement, the New Orleans food, the California food movement with Alice Waters and Jeremiah Tower and Wolfgang Puck, obviously the long history of the Northeastern food, but nobody had really landed and planted their flag into what I saw as an opportunity for us to do that with Florida.
Yeah. And you've described this as New World cuisine, looking at the Caribbean and at Cuba and the surrounding areas to really draw your inspiration, right?
Absolutely. I thought of it a lot like I think of Faulkner writing his books, about how all of his characters in every book that I'm aware of came from Yoknapatawpha County and the family tree from that place. And yet through that kind of very tight focus, much in the same way that Thornton Wilder did with his play Our Town, he was able to create a universal understanding. In some ways, Tennessee Williams had a very tight focus like that to his plays. And Tennessee lived in Key West, and so he was an inspiration to me too. And I got to meet him and perform for him as well. That's another story that we'll touch on maybe at some point in time. When I got to Miami, I had taken over this property on Ocean Drive. The owner of the hotel, he owned it, but he did let me do what I wanted to do, and it worked out. And that became the place where I moved from sort of relying much more on European dishes or fancy dishes from elsewhere in the United States to saying, no, I want us to celebrate Florida. The way the line worked was, instead of putting all of our food in the window in front of us, like most places, we had to kind of pass our food down to a little window that the servers would pick up down here. And so we would make our plates and pass and pass and pass. But over where that window is, which is called the pass, I put a map. I found this map of it covered from Central Florida down through, let's say, Venezuela. And I drew a huge circle on that map and thumbtacked that up to the wall over the pass. And I would say to my, 6 or 7 cooks that worked with me, this is where we're cooking from now. We're not cooking from Texas and Nebraska and France. We're cooking from here. We're really going to focus on this. And so I orchestrated my menu dialogue to try very much to speak of the New World. And the New World, of course, always reverberates with the Old World, the intersection of foods, the food histories. They were transformed by each other. Even tragic situations like, slavery from a food standpoint it vastly affected the New World. And then the correlation became that it began to affect the Old World too, because there were not things in the Old World like sugar, chocolate, vanilla, strawberries, chilies. None of those things were in the Old World. And so the transformation, especially after the time of Columbus, around by the time of Magellan in the mid 1550s, let's say, it was the biggest bang there ever has been in food. And Florida, where we were, was pretty much where the first footprints took place. So I felt like I had a lot of latitude. I had a lot of material to work with. And a guy that was a marketing guy for a hotel said to me at one point, Norman, you're doing something that's different, but the journalists don't know what to say. You got to come up with a handle for this thing. And there was a couple other people in town, other chefs that were also finding a lot of influence and a lot of inspiration from Florida. And there was this meeting at his hotel that we had, and people kind of bounced ideas back and forth. I, being the reader that I've always been, I was aware that we were coming up on the 500th anniversary of Columbus discovering, incorrect term, but let's just say it, discovering the New World. And I thought, well, it became known as the New World. So New World Cuisine makes sense to me. So what I began to do is I could say, the Southwestern food movement, the California food movement. What we do is similar to that, but we do it from this sphere, and that's the New World.
And you've paid such homage to it. You've really honored that area and the cuisine. And again, the history that came before you. But you are also a part of food history. I know you won't want to say it that way, but you are. So to set the scene for everyone, again, your star was rising at the same time as other icons in your peer group, such as Emeril and Thomas Keller, and of course, your dear friend and brother, Charlie Trotter. And it's the early 90s.
Yeah.
And you're in New Mexico. And 2025, you walk around, every other restaurant is fusion of some type. But you are the first person to actually use the word fusion. Tell us about how that came about and how it really took off from there.
Yes, in relationship to food, I am the first person that used that term. And like many things in my life, it came from the intersection of me finding a book in the same bookstore I bought. The James Beard Theory and Practice book was his book. And I have no idea, Sarah, why it attracted me so much. Sometimes I think there's magic in these things. You're holding them and it's telling you, take me home. It worried me. It's going to change your life. That book was called On Culture and Cuisine by Jean-Francois Revel. Now, it wasn't a cookbook, and it's not a cookbook. But my love of history and of culture convinced me to spend the $25 that day, which was a sizable amount of money for me at the time. And I took that book, and in the book, he essentially is describing cuisine with an arc of about 500 years. I have that book also still, and it's got so many underlinings and chapter marginalia, yellow highlighter. I mean, it just so rocked me. Why? Because I could see that his thesis in this book, and I could read it, was that he was pointing out that through the shifting sands of time over these centuries, from the time around 1400 through the modern era of the Nouvelle Cuisine, because that's the period of time that he takes on, talks about how mankind and civilization has this pendulum fascination between simplicity and complexity that goes back and forth over the decades and over the centuries. He talked about how at Taillevent, which was his sort of a stage name for this gentleman, he had a dish for tuna, oregano, and pears. And it struck me like people would think that would be a weird modern dish, right? But then he would talk about how in another aspect that people throw off the sort of the fancier food of the aristocracy and long for the home cooking. And in one place, he talks about the ongoing argument between simplicity and complexity. I was working in my little restaurant in Key West, and I was loving, learning about the fancy sauces, sabayons, and, learning high-end cooking, sauce making, but I was also adoring the simplicity of the Caribbean ingredients and food methodologies. In the book, Ravel says something about, after many a stormy scenes comes the marriage. And I wrote the words a fusion in the margin of the book. And then I began to sort of lay awake at night and think about, what am I doing? What direction am I going to take food in? And what is the premise behind it all? I mean, I wanted to always be very proficient. When I say the word cook, I mean, the aspects of the cooking. Chef is more like another side of it, the business side of it, or the organizational side of it. But the act of cooking, I still hold dear. I will always hold dear. But I was wondering what I was going to do with myself. And over the course of the next few months, I began to write a paper. And so I wrote this thing called On Fusion Cooking. Then I put it in a drawer. But I was rung up by some folks who were putting together a symposium in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they asked 4 of us to be on stage for, 45 minutes one morning during the symposia, and all of us to speak on a single subject, the subject being why we cook in the way that we cook. Those 4 people, besides myself, were Charlie Trotter, Emeril, Tom Douglas, and Lydia Shire from Boston. I had no speech. I hadn't made speeches. I hadn't been around a circuit doing talks. And to Janet, I said, what am I going to talk about? And then I realized, well, the one thing I could do is maybe share the fusion essay I wrote for whatever reason I wrote it for. And so that's what I did. And I was on stage that morning, and in the audience, you have everybody from Alice Waters to Ella Brennan to the Southwestern chefs, Dean Fearing and Robert Del Grande and Mark Miller. And I was quite nervous to do it, but I did it. And there was a journalist in the audience who put that out on the AP Wire. And when that happened, Fusion entered the dialogue in a bigger way.
And you changed the course of food history in that moment.
Fusion has always been something that has existed. I did not create fusion cuisine. I came up with a term that makes the most sense, no matter how much people try to kick it to the curb. It just keeps on coming back like rock and roll. So I realized, though, that when one villager meets the villager from another area and they start to trade recipes, that is the first spark of fusion cuisine. And we see it over and over and over again. How does it happen? War, marriages, travel, all these incidents of life cause us to find these fusions. Like here in town, there's a Peruvian wife that has a Mexican husband. They both cook these amazing things. And then they begin to transfer their ingredients, and that becomes a fusion. I think plenty of people do it without the sense of history. They do it just to be showing off, and that doesn't last. So in my own sort of area, what I do is New World Cuisine, but I look at fusion as this overarching thing. It's a sky, whereas the geographical parts of the world, whether we're talking about, a region of China or we're talking about little Haiti, right over here, we have these identities, this incredible patchwork quilt. Some people have talked about it being a melting pot in America. I don't buy the melting pot metaphor. It hasn't melted. It's a patchwork quilt. That's a much better way of looking at it, so that we can see all these lovely differences between the things at the same time.
Yeah, and to really understand different cultures and to bring us all together into the single quilt. And
Yes.
so that we can appreciate and see the beauty of each square.
Right.
So let's talk about where we are today. I mean, you are someone who, again, I consider a Renaissance person. You love to read. You're a wonderful writer. Everyone go check out Norman's Substack. He always has incredible recipes and stories on there. You've also done film. You've done television series such as Norman's Florida Kitchen. How do you find that doing all of these different creative outlets really feeds and fuels your food and the menus that we see at Norman's, as well as your soul? And how the heck do you get the energy to do it all?
I don't even think about that. It's just wanting to do it. Sometimes you have to sort of do the mundane things to make the time. But if you don't knock that part out to be able to find the things that you are impassioned to do, you're not living your fullest life. And I think that I've always had that deep yearning desire to live my fullest life. I learned early on that life can be fragile. My father died when I was 17, and he died suddenly. And so you never take it for granted. You just have to look at it like, I'm not wasting time on this planet. And the different endeavors, whether it's teaching through doing the video series, Norman's Florida Kitchen, or doing the cookbooks, of which now I've written 6, or sharing the memoir, the outside reading, the reading that I do for pleasure, so that I can continually refresh my mind and enrich my intellect with the stories that I want to be able to draw on. All those things, Sarah, they help fill up your menus very easily because you've got so much material to draw from. And the people I work with, when I do events, we just did this really almost a year-long endeavor to do an homage event that's ongoing called 90 at 90 for Jacques Pepin's 90th birthday. He turns 90 in December, and the foundation saw a video I did. Part of my Substack and YouTube endeavors are to share the key books that really matter to me the most. I call them my treasure book series. And I did a video on Jacques Pepin's book, La Technique. And somebody at the foundation saw it, and they were just getting the thinking going to doing this really big endeavor to celebrate Jacques. And they called me up and said, would you be interested in hosting one of the dinners? And I was like, I'm talking to the foundation right now? Yeah, I'm very interested in doing it. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to do 2, one in Miami and one in Orlando. And so over the course of the next 11 months, we had many, many emails, many phone calls. New people came on with different roles to play. Obviously, the chefs from Miami, I curated that list. And the chefs for Orlando, of which besides our restaurant, there were 8 other chefs. So it was a major quest to do it. Sometimes people would ask me, like, why do you spend so much time on this? I said, because Jacques, because the teachings that he's given, not only me, but to so many of us. I mean, you could talk to almost anybody certainly from my generation and even subsequent generations about Jacques Pepin, and everybody gets that look like he is the OG of OGs. This is the menu from the other night.
So
and
pretty.
The chefs that designed it, and the design, this watercolor design, that's from Jacques. In addition to doing all the things that he does, writing the books, doing the video series, still teaching at 90 out of his home. He also is an expert watercolorist, and he's got this small book that you get if you join the foundation. It's called The Art of the Chicken. Chickens are big in Jacques' world. And there's all these beautiful watercolors that he did. So talk about a person who's a Renaissance man. He's my Renaissance man.
I think both of you are the types of folks that can inspire someone to say, I don't have to put myself in a single lane or a single bucket. In fact, it's probably helpful that if you want to be considered a master or be successful, let's say at a business or within a certain position, to allow inspiration in and to allow other hobbies and passions in so that you can draw from the creativity here.
Totally agree. And I think it's part of my responsibility beyond sharing my recipes and my food knowledge or raw product knowledge with my teams. I'm often sending them things to read, quotes, historic figures that I think that they should know about. But I think that we have to show the young in the industry that there are many places to drink the water from to fill up their souls.
Yeah. What is the biggest piece of advice or a key lesson that you've learned over the years and through your own challenges of building your own businesses, your own brand, that someone who's looking to be a first-time entrepreneur can hear?
It's not getting knocked down that matters. It's getting back up that matters. I think one of the biggest challenges for people who are younger, in their 20s and 30s and 40s, et cetera, is that on social media, there's this projection that people buy into that everybody's always just happy and they're the best meal of their life, or they traveled here, everything's a bed of roses. And it's unfair to people that are growing up in this day. I didn't have that constant mirror showing me something that maybe was unfair. So don't let it get you down. Just keep on knowing that's kind of a purposeful projection as opposed to the way people sometimes feel on the inside. And so I believe that we shouldn't be jealous and we shouldn't be mad at them. We should realize that to find our humanity and try to project it is the most important thing. The gentleman that I kind of studied with Timothy Leary, his name was Richard Alpert, but he changed his name for Buddhist reasons to Baba Ram Das. And he has a beautiful quote. And he says something like, at the end of the day, we're all just walking each other home.
Yeah, I think that's such an important teaching because at the end of the day, like you said, we're all just walking each other home. And I think where we can really clash with someone else and not understand each other and lose a sense of humanity for each other is not recognizing that all of us will face challenges at some point in our lives. And some of them are the same, some of them are totally unique to us, but we all go through those tough times and those emotions. And to remember to be true to yourself, to be authentic. And that's when you will also attract the right things for you.
And the beautiful thing is in this industry, what I love about so much about being in hospitality and being able to feed people is that we find our commonality much more so when we're sharing a meal together. You share some bread and some sauces and some good wine and music and conversation, and then you find your common ground that we may not feel like we're ever going to find if all we do is doom scroll.
So, time for the hardest but best question of the podcast. So, this podcast is called The Perfect Bite, not only because it's a bit of a perfect bite of my career to date, working as an entrepreneur myself, but also working with founders in the food and bev space, which I've loved so much, as well as talking to folks, a perfect bite of the whole value chain of who brings us the food that we love so much. But it's also called The Perfect Bite because all of us have a perfect bite, a bite that is so special, we'll never forget it, that is so unique to our experiences and our taste buds. So, Norman Van Aken, what is your perfect bite?
I hope it's the next one. I think for me, too many come up, but I will tell you that the first time I think I experienced the first bite, I was a little boy and living at home in Lake County, Illinois. I was 5 or 6 years old. The family was still together. My father was having breakfast on the porch area of the house. I was probably at the little breakfast bar having a bowl of cereal, as I would have every day. But I knew my father was in the next room and he just mystified me. And I wanted to be near him every minute I could. He worked such long hours that I had to grab time. And I kind of pulled up the chair next to my dad who was reading the newspaper, and he was already dressed for work, suit, tie, white shirt, cufflinks. And I'm just like eyeballing him, just trying to drink them all in before he's got to go off. And he's got a cup of coffee and he's finishing his breakfast, at bacon and eggs kind of thing. And I said, Dad, can I try the coffee? And he looked at me, he put the paper down and he looks at me with this kind of benevolence look of like, you're not going to have coffee, but I understand that you're curious. And without a word, what he did was he took the creamer and a little bit of sugar and made the coffee much less bitter and blonder. And then he said, you can't drink the coffee, but what you can do is you can dip my toast into the coffee and you can have a bite of that. And I felt like I was being consecrated or something, and it was raisin toast and a little bit of cinnamon. And he said, fold it. And I did. And I took the toast and I dipped it in the coffee. And then I carefully brought my chin over so I wouldn't dribble on the floor. And I took this bite, and the coffee and the toast and the bit of butter and the raisins and the cinnamon all kind of swirled in there and made this transformative experience. And when I think back to the very, very first experiences of food that blew my mind, I think of that one.
That was so sweet. That was really special. Thank you. Got me like tearing up over here a little bit. I would also have that bite today. I think cinnamon raisin toast is a classic with coffee. That sounds wonderful.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in Key West, one of the things that you would have often, and Miami too, but you'd have your pan con mantequilla. So you would get your Cuban bread, which is absolutely no nutritional value in it whatsoever. But who cares, because a magic act for the brain. And you dip that into your cafe con leche. It's heaven.
And that was, well, your Midwestern version at a young age. I love that. It's very full circle.
Yeah. Yeah. Spend as much time with your loved ones as you can and share food.
Perfect ending here. Norman, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your stories and sharing your wisdom. Can you let our listeners know where they can find you in terms of your venues and your social accounts?
Absolutely. The restaurant is Norman's Orlando. My social handles are almost always my name, Norman Van Aken. On Substack, the number 1 is after Norman Van Aken, but on Instagram, it's Norman Van Aken, and Facebook and Blue Sky, if you go on that new one, is Norman Van Aken. So there's a consistency, the branding that needs to happen. Somebody taught me long ago, but somebody new is teaching more about all the time.
Thanks again for joining us, Norman. And everyone, this was Norman Van Aken's Perfect Bite. Thanks for tuning in to The Perfect Bite today. You can listen to future episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Thanks in advance for subscribing, rating, and reviewing. You can follow The Perfect Bite on social media @PerfectBitePod. Now go get something good to eat.